Over the course of one's life, a person will experience many losses and a variety of kinds of losses. Some of these losses will be big, noticeable, and painful. Others may be small with lesser impact. Some losses may be registered emotionally, but not necessarily cognitively. Some losses are good, other losses are debilitating. The process of loss is actually quite complex, but it is not often studied. Many losses are identified in the pages of Scripture. The first couple, Adam and Eve, lose a son killed by his brother. Joseph loses his family, and then he loses his freedom. Moses' family must give him up to another family. The Hebrews lose their freedom in Egypt. All Egyptians lose their firstborn son. Hannah believes she has lost the chance to have a child. Saul searches for lost donkeys. David loses Jonathan, Absalom, and his child with Bathsheba. Jeremiah loses his freedom and his safety. Daniel and his 3 friends are threatened with losing their lives. Mary and Joseph lose Jesus in the temple. Those who follow Jesus believe they lost their Messiah. In Philippians 3:8, Paul says that he counts everything as loss relative to knowing Christ. The book of Revelation takes place with John in exile, having lost friends, family, and safety. These are examples of various kinds of losses, but barely scratch the surface of what we find in the Bible. In this session, we will define loss, we will consider the elements of loss, the characteristics of loss, and the various types of loss that individuals experience. Finally, we will briefly consider the relationship between loss and our other terms, crisis, trauma, and grief. How do these fit together? Understanding this relationship is important to ultimately providing effective help. Loss is not readily defined in very much of the literature. Writers talk about it, but don't tend to define it. The assumption seems to be that everyone knows what loss is, and thus there isn't a need to define it. My definition is this: loss is the removal, gradual or sudden, of something meaningful to an individual. Generally, the loss occurs in a manner that what was lost is not retrievable. Elements of a loss. Loss is a truly complex process. Like holding a diamond in the light, there are many facets to it. To begin to understand it, let's first consider some of the elements of loss. Loss has a focus. The focus of the loss can be a person, i.e., a loved one who passes away, a coworker who takes another job, or some kind of relationship breakup. The focus of a loss can be an object, for instance, a car, a cell phone, or a pet. The focus of a loss can be a concept, loss of freedom or loss of identity. Loss has a value. We don't tend to experience loss if something is not of value to us. Thus, the greater the value, the greater the sense of loss. And in this, value is not necessarily a monetary concept in every instance. Two people can lose the same object, but can be impacted very differently because they value the object differently. The means of the loss. Loss is involuntary when something is taken away from us without our permission. The loss of a pet, a stolen laptop, would be involuntary types of losses. But loss can actually be voluntary in some instances. A voluntary loss occurs when a person surrenders something voluntarily. Placing a baby up for adoption is a very clear example. Moving away from a beloved house, city, or state. Selling your first car. Even a voluntary loss, one a person chooses to do, can register as a loss. Permanence of the loss. Loss in most instances is permanent. The thing that's lost can't be retrieved, revived, or restored. Loss can also be temporary. A temporary loss is one that is reversible. For instance, a stolen car is located, a lost class ring is found, or trust in a spouse is restored. Characteristics of loss are important to understand as well. In addition to elements, loss tends to have various other possible characteristics. Loss can be gradual or sudden. Some losses happen very quickly, while others progress over time. A disease like ALS or Lou Gehrig syndrome happens over several years, while a heart attack takes place suddenly. Loss can be conscious or unconscious. Many losses register at the conscious level. A person is fully aware of the loss. There are some losses, however, that take place outside of a person's awareness. Sometimes in counseling, I can see an individual become aware of a loss or losses that they may have experienced but haven't previously registered as loss. The cumulative effect. If a person has experienced a number of recent losses, a current loss may have a greater impact. Reminder of other losses. Especially if a person has not worked through past losses, a current loss can be a reminder of past losses. An example would be a woman who had a young child die may have difficulty later when other children approach the time to move away to college. To further understand loss, let's consider different types of losses that a person may experience. Objective or concrete loss. Examples of objective loss would be death of a loved one or any clear-cut loss of a person or object. Abstract or subjective loss. Abstract loss is the loss of anything conceptual. Examples include loss of freedom, loss of identity, loss of sense of trust, loss of sense of safety, loss of a sense of sanity. There are many abstract losses that a person may experience. Abstract losses often occur at a more affective level or the level of one's feelings. A person may feel this type of loss but may not completely understand it or be able to pinpoint the related struggle. Imagined loss is what a person worries they have lost or are about to lose. Examples of imagined loss is a person who worries that they are about to experience a miscarriage, a person who fears that they have cancer, or a person who fears that a marriage partner is going to leave them. Imagined loss may or may not ever become a reality. A person may have an imagined loss for many years. Threatened loss is any kind of pending loss, and especially one where the loss is controlled by another person. Examples include a boss constantly threatening to fire one of his workers, or a worker constantly threatening to quit his or her job. Another common threatened loss is the spouse who regularly threatens to leave the marriage. Ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss, in her book Loss, Trauma, and Resilience, provides us information about ambiguous loss, and there are two types. The first is when there's physical absence but emotional presence. Examples would be prisoners of war or those missing in action, an abducted child, a runaway child, separated spouses or divorced parents. And in this one, there is an emotional presence of a person who used to be there, but a physical absence. The second type is physical presence, but emotional absence. Examples of this one would be an aging parent, a parent with any kind of dementia or Alzheimer's, a depressed family member, a family member with a brain injury or any kind of head injury that leads to different personality. One of the big problems with ambiguous loss is that a person doesn't have closure. The person can't grieve, which leaves them in a kind of emotional limbo. They're kind of stuck. A person can experience ambiguous loss for years with no resolution and really no real closure around the matter. What is the relationship of loss to crisis, trauma, and grief? Well, it seems simple. Loss is really a complex process, as we have discussed. In relationship to crisis and trauma, both of these often produce loss or losses. Crises can result in loss, although they don't always. Trauma always produces loss, and often multiple concrete, abstract, imagined, or ambiguous losses. Loss creates the need to grieve. Part of the route of dealing with loss is learning to identify and grieve the loss. And it is to an understanding of grief that we will turn now in our next session.